Welcome to the Counter Narrative Podcast, a show designed to change the way we talk and think about education. By sharing stories of successes and triumphs, we aim to challenge the dominant narrative that often negatively portrays our disenfranchised populations. I'm your host, Charles Williams, an educator for 15 years, a current school principal in Chicago, and an educational consultant. Let's get started. If you haven't heard about Anchor, it's the easiest way to make a podcast. Don't believe me? Here's 5 reasons why. First, it's free. Second, there's creation tools that allow you to record and edit your podcast right from your phone or computer. 3, Anchor will distribute your podcast for you, so it can be heard on Spotify, Apple Podcast, and so many more. 4, you can make money from your podcast with no minimum listenership. And 5, it's everything you need to make a podcast, all in one place. Download the free Anchor app or go to anchor.fm to get started. In this episode, I chat with Carlys Spina, an educator with 15 years of experience in multilingual education, including her service as an EL teacher, a 3rd grade bilingual classroom teacher, and a district-wide EL, bilingual, and dual language instructional coach. She is currently serving 8 schools in a linguistically rich community of over 60 languages and over 800 active EL students. Spina has engaged in the successful co-creation of several parent outreach programs, Title I tutoring programs for students in grades 3 through 5, mentoring programs for middle school students, co-teaching initiatives, and much, much more. She is deeply passionate about equity and advocacy for multilingual learners and fights for access and inclusive opportunities for kids and families. Spina actively fights against food insecurity in the community she serves, and she has spoken at various national conferences and events, and has even received several awards over the years, including the Illinois Education Association Reg Weaver Human and Civil Rights Award in 2015, and the Distinguished Service Award for Excellence in the Team category for EL Community Engagement in 2019. She was the WIDA Featured Educator in April of 2019 and was named a Paul Harris Fellow in July of 2019. Spina is an active member of the EL bilingual community on social media and enjoys networking and growing with teachers and leaders across the country. She is currently working on her first book with EduMatch Publishing. During our chat, we talked about the need for us to change the systems in which we operate. She shared her experiences working with parents of linguistically diverse students and the importance of amplifying their voices, not speaking on their behalf. Spina also examined the varied definitions of parental involvement as they shift due to cultural differences. Maybe, just maybe, this is a reflection of perspective and not necessarily attitude. We also discussed methods of engaging the community, moving beyond simply checking off tasks and instead embedding them into our everyday practices. She encourages educators to embrace their statuses as change agents and recognize that there are no small wins. In fact, incremental gains lead to monumental success. I hope that you enjoy this episode as much as I enjoyed recording it. Good morning, Carly, and thank you so much for being on the Counter Narrative Podcast. How are you today?
Good morning. I am doing so well. How are you?
I'm doing great. Thank you for asking. Carly, before we get started, if you could do me a favor and just introduce yourself to our guests, maybe share a little bit about who you are, how you got there, and maybe something interesting about yourself.
Awesome. So, I am currently serving as an EL bilingual instructional coach for my school district, which means 8 schools from pre-K all the way up through eighth grade. And we have a beautiful, linguistically rich community. We have over 60 languages represented in our school district and over 800 active EL students. And what's beautiful, I think, about my role right now is I'm able to work with everybody, every teacher across every content area. I'm able to support programming and teachers and parents, administrators, associates. I get to, everybody is my teammate, and I think that's so fun. I have 14 years of experience in multilingual education. I was an EL teacher for 5 years. I was a third grade classroom teacher in a bilingual program for 6 years. And I'm in my third year right now as the district EL bilingual instructional coach. I love going to conferences. I love professional learning. I'm starting to speak at different conferences and having a lot of fun with that, although now many of them are virtual, which is still fun. Another opportunity to learn. And I love being a part of, our professional learning network online on Twitter and on Facebook. And right now I'm currently working on my first book with EduMatch Publishing, which I'm very, very excited about.
Wonderful, wonderful. So, Carly, can you tease us? What is the title of your book, or do you have a title yet?
I have a working title right now. So it is tentatively titled Beyond Visuals, Innovative Supports for Multilingual Learners. And we're going to talk about all the ways to kind of move beyond that staple of like, just add visuals and really, kind of dive into different things that we can be doing that is really going to make an impact for supporting our multilingual students.
Wonderful, wonderful. And Carly, my wife is a bilingual teacher, an EL teacher, and in fact, that is how we met, working with the same population. So can you share with us, because this is something that I am passionate about, can you share a little bit about how you got into this work and what you find
Yeah.
fascinating with it?
Yeah. So I grew up in Lincoln Square in Chicago. And what's interesting about Chicago, and I know you're a Chicago guy,
Hmm.
what's interesting about Chicago is we have all these different neighborhoods that are the way Chicago kind of developed and formed was, we had all these different pockets of like linguistic and cultural communities. So there's a Greek neighborhood, there's a Mexican community, there is a Swedish American community, like all of these different pockets. And so growing up in Lincoln Square was interesting because it historically was a German American community. And then when I was there in like the 80s and 90s, we really did have a pretty diverse community, a neighborhood. And so we had different languages on the block and different cultures on the block. And everyone was outside, everyone was playing, their own music and cooking their own meals. And you'd walk down the street and, smell the beautiful smells, and you dance to everyone's different music. And it was really cool. And my mom was a youth pastor for a bit of time when I was a kid. And she was really passionate about making sure that we understood and we always considered perspectives that didn't match our own. And so while a lot of kids at school were, reading Goosebumps books for their book reports, my mom was kind of pushing us in a different direction. She's like, nope, you're going to read Amos Fortune Freeman, or you're going to read the poetry of Phyllis Wheatley, or you're going to read about Dolores Huerta. And so that was always just kind of what we did as kids. And then I started to take like formal classes when I got to high school for Spanish. And then I continued studying Spanish and practicing. And I was always kind of frustrated with the teaching of Spanish, of how it was very like, this is correct and this is not correct. And this is, this, it was always like there was a linguistic bias present in a lot of our Spanish classes in the suburban monolingual high
Yeah.
school that I went to. And so, that was always kind of interesting. And then once I got to college, I always knew I was going to be a teacher. That was just always something that was like in my heart, I always felt called to do. And then when I was taking my education courses in college, I was, you go through different, teaching experiences as a pre-service teacher. And I was just amazed at the level of linguistic oppression and linguistic inequities that existed in many of the schools. And again, many of them were in Chicago, which is a very diverse, city. And it was kind of a source of kind of deep reflection for me. And so I knew I had to get my EL endorsement, and eventually got my bilingual certificate. And I knew that I needed to use my privilege to support others and to elevate others. And I think I found that community that I feel very, very passionate about serving.
Well, thank you. I appreciate the work that you're doing. Um, Carly, I mean, this is like the ideal, at least in my mind, situation, right, for this podcast of the idea of changing the narrative around some of our marginalized students. Can you jump into that a little bit about how your work is helping our linguistically diverse students maybe, highlight some stories of positivity around them?
Yeah. So, this is my 14th year in my school district. And while I feel like we are pushing a lot on kind of the narrative that's been passed down and circulated and inherited amongst, teachers and administrators and just the general community. So we are pushing on the narrative, but, changing systems doesn't happen overnight. And it's a bit of a dance, I think. Dr. Jose Medina is somebody I follow on Facebook and Twitter, and he is this dynamic dual language educator and expert. And he always talks about, like, we've got to dismantle all these systems of linguistic oppression that exist. And it is kind of that dance of, sometimes you have those moments of like, oh, I think that was a small win, but we can't call it a small win. It's a big, every win in education is a big win. And so sometimes these baby steps feel like, they're so small, but, and we rarely take the time to celebrate them. So some of the things that I feel like, wow, those were small moments, but such big impact. When my district was able to really engage our largest language groups through the formation of a BPAC, or a bilingual parent advisory council. I think that was a huge, like, aha moment for my school district. And I think many who are on that BPAC journey, as a lot of folks will say about the students and families that I serve, oh, those parents are not involved, or those parents don't care. Right. And that's like one of my like I cringe. It gives me a rash every time I hear someone say that, because my definition of being an involved parent might be different than my neighbor's definition, or my sister's definition, or my teammate's definition. And so I think, as people kind of consider what it means to be an involved parent or an engaged parent in student learning. So I think when we started our BPAC, we had a really thriving group of parents and guardians who were like, no, we are ready to take this charge. We were just never invited into this space. We were never invited into this conversation. We were kind of assigned like parent workshops, and like, we're just going to make the decisions for you. Like, there's, an administrative team or a group of teachers that are like, we're all monolingual and we're all Caucasian, but we're going to assign you guys a workshop on how to read with your kids. When really the parents were never polled, or the parents were never asked or brought into the planning. And they're like, no, we have some other ideas of like what's going to make a really big impact for our neighbors and our community.
Yeah, it's the we know best attitude.
Yes, exactly. So, and then it's so funny because then again, we fall back on that narrative of like, oh, they didn't come to our, our parent workshop. Oh my gosh, they're not involved. They don't care. And you're like, no, 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 no. You're just going about it the wrong way. um, and then we had a really beautiful moment when like our town, our village offers like these community, like civic engagement or like civic awards. And so I was like, you know what, we really need some more diverse representation, like really have representation that reflects who our community is. And so I nominated our BPAC president, and she ended up receiving like a special committee award. And she spoke to the entire community in an acceptance speech. And it was the first time that anyone other than a Caucasian English speaker had won that type of award in our community. So the fact that she was standing up on that platform, speaking two languages, and sharing a little bit about her work and her passion, and being thanked like personally by the village president, it was like such a huge win, such a huge moment for her and for our entire community.
Carla, I think you touched on something important there when you talked about, the decisions being made for groups of individuals. And then, when those groups say, well, I don't want that, or I don't need that, or maybe it's, I don't know how to interact with this thing that you're trying to do, right? We have our own way, and when there's that failure then to connect, there's an immediate assumption about, the value that those groups of individuals have on education. And so I think that's important. What you just said was that stop trying to make those decisions for these groups, and instead of talking at them, right, talk with them.
Right, right. And not only like, a lot of us are talking about this idea of like, using our voice to like, to lead this or to change this or to counter this. But instead of like, I'm not going to speak for anybody. I want to amplify their voice.
Mm.
I want to hear it from them, and I want them leading the charge, and I want to give them the platform to do so.
So, Carly, I'm just curious. We talk a lot on these shows about the obstacles that we face in doing this work. What do you think are maybe some of the reasons or the rationalities behind these mindsets that so often paint our linguistically diverse families in this negative light?
I think a part of it is just what we've been talking about is who is at the table making decisions or setting guidelines or developing things. And then the lack of like, people always say, oh, I create a welcoming classroom environment, or my school is very welcoming. But if you look at that and you really push on it and say, okay, but what are you doing? You're saying oh, we have an open door policy, but how are you actively engaging those communities? And how, if you're just kind of putting it as like as a poster on the wall of like, we're inclusive, yay. Or, a lot of folks will say like, we have a diversity night in May. So we can check the box. We have done diversity for this
Right.
year.
Cinco de Mayo, the taco.
Yes, exactly. So instead of like actively engaging and like elevating the status of other languages aside from English and having that just be a daily practice, an embedded practice. One thing that I talk about when I talk with teachers is a lot of teachers are like, I would love to invite more language usage other than English, but I'm monolingual and I'm uncomfortable with not knowing. I don't speak Mongolian. I don't speak Russian. I don't have those skills. And, it's good to remind teachers, you don't have to be bilingual or multilingual to welcome languages into your classroom. Like, and having it present on the walls of your school and the walls of your cafeteria and the walls of your classroom, or creating, multilingual word walls. That doesn't have to be this big, scary space for us. And, and if it is so uncomfortable, maybe we need to sit in that for a little bit. We need to sit in that uncomfortable space, and that's okay.
I'm curious, I think depending on where you're at, when I know I speak to people and they hear, bilingual students, they immediately say, "Oh, Spanish." But like you just said, you referenced Russian, you referenced, Mongolian. In fact, you said in your area, the schools that you serve, you have over 60 languages.
Yes. Yes. And it's a beautiful thing. And it's interesting too to think about. We did this one activity, and this is a great one for anyone listening, to try in their spaces, no matter what grade you teach, no matter where you are, is having teachers kind of stop and reflect about their own linguistic stories and that of their students. So we can even invite that conversation and say, how many languages do we speak as a group, as a class of second graders, or as a group of seventh grade social studies students? And kids can offer in, well, in my home we speak Polish, but my dad, he used to know Polish, English, and Russian, but he only passed down English and Polish to me. And that just invites this great conversation about our linguistic stories and our linguistic identities, and how they've kind of come to play out. And everybody has a different story. And it's cool once teachers and students have that conversation together, is they write down all of those languages that exist in their space, even if they're not using it, during class, to have that be a part of their story. And then they post it outside of their classroom door so that everybody walking by knows about, the second graders in that classroom, how many languages are there. And then it's cool to see, we had, every school in my district has participated in this. And it's really interesting to see and walk by and see, like, identify all the different languages, like Lithuanian. That's not a common one that you see a lot. And then it's really neat to see the flip side. So like when parents come in for parent teacher conferences or an event at the school, they walk by and they're like, whoa, 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 there's a Lithuanian speaker in room 107. That's crazy. But I speak Lithuanian. And so it's cool to see the parents' identities, honored and represented on the walls too.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think that's a great, approach. People, their minds are blown. First of all, they cannot ever figure out what I am. I get everything from, Caribbean to Egyptian to, to about everything. And then, I share that my grandmother spoke German, and then they're like, "Wait, what?" So, I knew, like, if I heard, like Mach schnell, like, oh, I bet we better hurry up. Let's go. And they're just like, no, this is so weird. But yeah. So Carly, I know you've touched a little bit on some of these things, but if you were to give someone, a tip or an approach, maybe they have, this bilingual population, or they just want to, maybe change their own mindset. Do you have any tips or strategies for our listeners?
So I think number one is owning your status as a change agent. And I think that's kind of a hard space to step into because it pushes us outside of our comfort zones. But no matter what your role is in a school or in a district or in a system, everybody has that role and that opportunity to lead for change. And so no matter what your role is, you have that power and that ability and that platform, and you can lead and you can push and flip lenses. And then also just remembering that there is no small win in education. We work with children, we work with human beings. So every win is a big win. My friend Dorina, from the hashtag Believe Cafe, she always says, incremental is monumental. So take time to celebrate those wins that other people might say, oh, that's a small win. No, you got to remember that's a big win. And then just always, don't speak for others, find their stories and amplify their voices. And it's good for us to step outside of our comfort zones.
Carly, I'm going to hold on to that last one that you shared. The whole purpose behind this podcast is, if you don't tell your story, someone will, and I think so often we keep thinking about that idea of amplifying your own voice, speaking your own voice. But we also have to understand on the other side of that, allow other people to tell their stories as well. and not to speak for them. So I'm going to take and hold on to that one if you don't mind.
I love it. Thank you.
Carly, I know you mentioned Belief Cafe, but I do always want to pause for a moment and allow you to give some shout outs. There are a lot of excellent work happening in education. And so just, give some love to some people who deserve it.
Well, I have to give a big shout out to all of the EL bilingual and dual language teachers in Glenview District 34 because they are doing big, big things. They are making the EL program and the EL classroom like the place to be. Some of our other parents were like, how come I wasn't invited to that cool dance party or that cool event? And we're like, oh, sorry, we're VIP. So I'm so proud of all the work that's happening with their ideas and their passions. And then I have to give a shout out to some of my Twitter buddies and Facebook buddies. So Carol Salva, Dorina Sacmanabua, Valentina Gonzalez, Emily Francis, Michelle Shorey, and Arena McGrath are always posting all these amazing tools on Twitter. Jody Nolf, Pamela Broussard, and Dr. Jose Medina. He is like this force that just keeps me going. And I'm so proud to be a part of this community that is really passionate about flipping lenses and opening doors and, asking the hard questions and really focused on creating equitable spaces for our kids and families.
Wonderful, wonderful. Thank you. And so I will make sure that we include some ways to reach out to that wonderful group. Please make sure, listeners, that you go and follow them. And speaking of following, Carly, can you share with us, how can we find you and follow you to continue this conversation?
Yeah, so I am super, super active on Twitter. You guys can find me at Mrs. Spina's class. And then I have a blog that I often update, and it is Innovative Inspiration for Language Learners. And so we can make sure that we link that here. But please find me on Twitter. I love talking about these things, and I'm super passionate about connecting educators to, great resources and great reflective questions. And I love learning and growing with other folks.
Well, Carly, I want to say thank you not only for being on the show, but thank you so much for all the work that you're doing and for a population that is near and dear to my heart, our linguistically diverse students. So I just want to say thank you, thank you, thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I loved being here on the show today. I'm so, so excited. Thank you for the opportunity.
I want to thank you for listening to the Counter Narrative Podcast. If you like what you're hearing, please be sure to like and subscribe on your favorite podcast platform. You can also follow the show on Twitter at the CN Podcast and the host at _CW Consulting. Take care.